I was able to transition my career into becoming a full-time Unity developer in my mid-30s. I did this without having any sort of educational background in coding, and never even worked as a software developer. Although I have a university degree, it's in business management. And before Unity, the only programming I had ever done was in my high school Java class, which I got a D in, and I messed around a bit using RPG Maker in the early 2000s. I'm not telling you this because I'm bragging, I'm telling you this because I'm sure there are many of you out there who would like to work as professional game developers and maybe aren't quite sure about how to break into the industry. And I feel like I had a particularly uphill climb to land my first game development job because I didn't even have a computer science degree, which, by the way, is something a lot of potential employers want to see in their candidates. But before I tell you how I did it, here's a bit of backstory. I grew up in the 90s, and the game dev industry was far different back then than it is today.
The difference between this game and all the rest is in the name, Nintendo 64.
I remember being told that I would probably have to move to Japan and try to work for Nintendo if I really ever wanted to be a professional game developer. That may sound a bit harsh or sarcastic, but to be fair, at the time it probably wasn't too far from the truth. Nowadays, indie game dev studios are everywhere. The opportunities that exist today are far more plentiful than they were when I was growing up. But on the other hand, so is the competition. Today, you can get a degree from a variety of different colleges in game development, where you get to learn the most cutting-edge technology while collaborating with your peers. That's pretty awesome, and that's not something that existed when I was starting my university days. For me, even though I started learning Unity around 2017, I never really imagined that I could ever be anything other than just a hobbyist developer. Not only did I lack the educational background, but game developer jobs were probably riddled with recent graduates who were getting to practice their craft on a daily basis. On the other hand, my day-to-day was working in the HVAC industry, doing sales, marketing, and a bit of IT work here and there. It wasn't until early 2022 when I had any reason to even believe otherwise. It was around that time when I was contacted by a recruiter on LinkedIn who invited me to apply for a senior Unity developer job at their downtown office in Toronto. Of course, I happily said yes. And you know what happened, don't you? I didn't get the job. I didn't even get invited back for a second stage of the interview. But that did change my perception about something. Someone out there believed that I had what it took to work as a professional game developer at their company, even though my LinkedIn profile only barely scratched the surface talking about any of my own game development experience. Now, to be fair, at this point, I had already completed several courses on Udemy for game development. I had developed from start to finish 2 Android games that I had launched on the Google Play Store. So my experience wasn't exactly zero at this point, but it was still hard to think of myself as a professional game developer. Still, it had changed my perception. I signed up for another Udemy course I had seen. This one was called How to Get a Job in the Game Dev Industry. This was honestly a life-changing course, and I've linked it down in the video description, and I would highly recommend you taking it yourself. A few of the highlights. First, employers aren't looking for people who are aspiring game developers. Employers want to hire professionals, so even if you don't feel like you're a professional developer yourself, you should still treat yourself like one. Second, be as specific about the role you're applying for as you can be. In other words, if you're applying for a gameplay developer position, it's better to talk about how you've created enemy AI systems rather than talking about how you've done 3D modeling or worked with a database. However, in my own experience, this also can depend on the company you're applying for. A smaller studio may actually be looking for more of a generalist, so mentioning these skills might not always be a bad idea. It really depends on the company you want to work for, so that's important to take into consideration on your applications too. Finally, the course talks about having something called an artifact. That's essentially something special you can do for the company you're applying for during the interview phase to prove your value as a potential employee. So for example, if you're an artist, then maybe try redesigning one of their characters. If you're a programmer, take a look at one of their existing games and perhaps try writing some pseudocode as to how you might handle the situation. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't create an artifact when I was applying for jobs. I feel like that's more relevant for things like artists and narrative designers, not quite as much for the programmer role, so again, take that with a grain of salt. Obviously, the course goes into way more detail than what I'm saying here, so again, I highly recommend taking this course if you're serious about wanting to get any sort of game dev job. By the way, Udemy courses often go on sale for crazy amounts, like 90% off, so if you do go to the link and check out the course and it looks a tad pricey, just wait a little bit and chances are you can get a huge discount. I applied all the knowledge that I had learned from taking this course. I updated my resume, my cover letter, my LinkedIn profile, and my portfolio. I positioned everything to show that I was not an aspiring game developer. I was a professional one, even if I didn't quite believe it myself yet. Guess what happened? I started getting job interview requests. It took a few months of searching, but eventually I found a small company in Vancouver who hired me to be their full-time in-house Unity developer. What exactly did I put on my resume anyway that got me hired for my first Unity developer job? Like I said earlier, typically employers are looking for candidates who have a degree in computer science. However, there's also often a stipulation: equivalent industry experience. Since I didn't have the degree, I was going to have to rely on the industry experience requirement. However, there was a problem with that too. Technically, I didn't have industry experience either because I had never worked in the industry. So how do you show that you have industry experience without ever having worked as a professional game developer before? Well, this is where having your own portfolio and your own projects come into play, and it's why it's so important to practice as often as you can with the game engine of your choice. As I mentioned earlier, I had been working in HVAC for approximately 8 years doing marketing, sales, and some IT work. I didn't want all of that to be for nothing, but I couldn't really use the marketing or sales for a developer job. So this is where I had to lean into the fact that I did have some IT experience there. I extrapolated as much relevant information from this position as I could. Ultimately, this didn't have anything to do with game development, but it did show that I was competent with computers and technology. Still, as this wasn't directly related to jobs, this went on to page 2 of my resume. Page 1 is where I put details about my most relevant projects. Basically, I filled it up with details about the Unity games that I had built for myself. At this point, I had fully completed 3 Unity games already, with a 4th one that was currently under development, so there was content to put there. It was important to highlight a variety of Unity principles that I had used and implemented into my games to make it as diverse as possible and really showcase my talent. Now, I found that most game developer job postings fit into one of 3 categories. Number 1 was mobile application developers. In other words, companies are looking for developers who have knowledge and experience developing for Android and iOS. Second, multiplayer experience. If you have knowledge of how to use multiplayer in Unity or Unreal, that ultimately gives you a huge advantage. And third was Unreal experience, knowledge about blueprints and or C++. Because all of my personal projects were Unity single-player applications made for mobile devices, it was the first of these that I was applying for. I knew I would have better odds if I could zero in and focus on the job postings that were the most closely related to the experience that I had. I think it's also worth mentioning that you don't necessarily have to tick every single box on a job posting. For instance, this is the actual job posting for the position that I ultimately ended up getting hired for. As you can see, it actually mentioned multiplayer on the job posting, which I clearly did not have experience with, yet in the end, this didn't matter. It also mentioned that they were looking for someone with Firebase experience. If you don't know what Firebase is, it's a database that's used commonly with Android and iPhone applications. I had never heard of Firebase until I saw it on this job posting, so clearly I didn't have that experience. But my resume was enough to get my foot in the door and land me an interview. In the interview process, I was able to explain that although I didn't have that experience yet, based on how I had been able to pick up and learn Unity, I would be able to pick up multiplayer and Firebase without too much of an issue. And after I was hired, well, that's exactly what I did. So even if you don't have all the experience that's required for a position, as long as you can demonstrate how you can make up for those missing bullet points, then typically it's not too much of an issue. So I went through the interview process. I remember that I spoke with passion and I spoke with confidence, and it paid off. In fact, Later, my employer even told me that that was one of the reasons he hired me, because he could see just how passionate I was about working for this company. I think it's important to mention this because it's not just about the hard skills that you have, the coding and the technology, but also about how well you can communicate them and how well you can demonstrate and show your passion as a developer. I got the job and I was ecstatic. No longer was I just a hobbyist developer, but now a professional one who was getting paid to work with Unity on a daily basis. But my journey didn't stop there either. About a year later, I started working at my local Code Ninjas branch as their lead code sensei. Here, I get to teach kids how to make games and how to work with Unity. And by the way, if you're looking to get some job experience, I highly recommend looking into teaching at Code Ninjas or other coding schools. Now, even though I had a game developer job, I was still compelled to work on my own game development projects. I onboarded a couple of team members to work with me on an upcoming Steam game called Zombie Barrel Blast. This is going to be an exciting 2D platformer with strong Donkey Kong vibes, as it focuses on barrel blasting. A link to the Steam page can be found in the video description, so go check it out and wishlist it if you think this game looks fun. I've also started creating more videos for this channel, including a how to make a 2D platformer in Unity series. I've also started another channel called Indie Game Discovery, where I'm interviewing smaller game devs about their projects. This has been my own game dev journey, and I have a feeling that it's far from over. But to summarize, here are my top recommendations for anyone looking to break into the game development industry. First, make sure to align all of your platforms, including your resume, cover letter, LinkedIn profile, and any professional portfolio, as you being the best of whatever field it is you want to be. Whether that's a developer, a gameplay designer, a level designer, or an artist, make sure you are not an aspiring one, you are a professional. Second, go take the Udemy course called How to Get a Job in the Game Development Industry, which I've linked in the video description. I took this course, and honestly, I don't think I would have gotten my first Unity developer job if I hadn't gone through it. And finally, make sure you have your own projects which you can really showcase. A strong portfolio will really help you stand out against your competition, and this is a very competitive space to break into. You don't need to be the most experienced developer, artist, or whatever it is in the world to get hired, but it does help if you can sell yourself as one. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, any of your own thoughts or experiences to share, or even want to talk about how you got your first job in the game development industry, please drop a comment, because I'm sure myself and many others would love to hear about it. Check the links in the video description for Zombie Barrel Blast and go wishlist that if it looks exciting to you. And please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to this channel and possibly even Indie Game Discovery if that speaks to you as well. Thanks again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.